Not only has computers changed the game in cartography, so too did the internets, which is the focus here in Lecture 9. How did I become a semi-professional geographer? I grew up an only child reading the Rand McNally atlas that was reachable from my backseat location in the vehicle. This helped pass the time, but also I started to learn about maps and places, and well, now I'm here. I mention this to further illustrate the massive changes in cartography in my 42 years of life. Hardly anybody uses these maps anymore when traveling. Instead, it's smartphones, tablets, or GPS devices telling us where to go and how to get there. Would I have learned geography if I was born today? Probably not, unless I had a live mapping app on my tablet. I was watching Cocomelon and Kanto and Peppa Pig from my backseat location. Now, perhaps the most amazing part of computers plus internet equals cartography, or essentially this new world of computer cartography, is that most of it's been fairly free and accessible cost-wise to consumers. You think about that Rand McNally map, that was like a $9-10 thing. You know, it still probably is, but I don't need it. I got my Google Maps. And of course, yeah, it requires smartphones and all of that. But if you have a smartphone, you can get the Google Map app for free, and essentially you don't need the Rand McNally Atlas to tell you where to go. Thus, accessibility and low cost have thus far been the hallmarks of the web map era that is upon us now. Now, will that continue? Let's hope so, but it's something to note, a good thing about the current era we're in. Before I mention different types of web maps, it's important to note that when I mention requires interactivity, you have to think about the consumer, the end user. And so when you're creating a web map, one of the things is you have to think about and constantly adapt, update, adjust as you learn how your map viewer interacts with your particular map. So that's one of the things that's very important, is trying to understand how your map viewer, because you might have your particular understanding of something, but how your map viewer interacts and uses a particular web map is very important. So something to keep in mind. So constantly revising, constantly updating. Once again, that goes back to something I mentioned at the beginning of the semester. Further, if you have any computer programming skills, highly valuable, because many of these web maps require computer programming skills for their development and their implementation. First type of map I'm going to talk about is called a static web map, and that's one in which the user, they can't really interact. I mean, it's like kind of like an image or a picture. You can kind of zoom in and look at pixels and all of that, but you're not going to change your scale. You're not going to change the data. You're not going to change the time. So this is something like maybe a link to a PDF web map. Something in which you can't actually interact with other than looking at it. Not saying it's not valuable. I mean, these maps are quite useful in many different ways, static web maps, for providing information. But the kind of idea here is the user, in terms of their interactivity, very limited, very low interaction. Dynamic web maps, those are ones in which they also have low interactivity, but the key thing is here, there's change that's happening on the map. Now, this might be simple as a .gif or .gif, however you call it, .gif, in which it just kind of shows a movement over time, let's say a movement of an object on a map, or from 2000, an image, and then 2005, an image, 2010, so on, in which you get those time series. Those are examples of dynamic web maps, but the key thing is the user really can't do much. And so essentially the user is just looking at a web map that's being produced in which it's changing. An animated web map is one in which the user actually can change, and it's typically changed through time. So we've already looked at animated maps in a previous online lecture, but the idea here is animated maps in which you can change the time. And so you can maybe press play and then pause it and go back and then go forward and so on. So that's an animated web map. An interactive web map is one in which you can actually change and zoom into an area. You can turn off maybe the data sets, turn off different layers. You can change the base map. So you can change different things within the map. Now, one of the things I want to mention is all these types of maps, it's not like they're containerized where it can only be one. Oftentimes web maps are a couple of these, or maybe even more than a couple. So it's something to keep in mind, maybe for a future exam question, or just when you're looking at web maps, is they can be more than one of these particular types. Finally, a real-time web map, that's one in which you see real-time information. So a lot of times people will when you're traveling, they'll fire open the Google Maps and they'll put it on the traffic mode. And what it'll do is it'll show you in different colors the real-time traffic situation. So if you see red up ahead on the map and your route is currently green, that means you got some traffic up ahead of you. So that's providing you real-time information. Or you might be able to click on a particular a weather app in which you can go click on a particular weather map that's showing the real-time radar, what it's looking like right at the moment. And then maybe you can go click on a particular weather station. You can see an image from it. Maybe they have a TV station has a canned image from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. You can click on that camera and look at a real-time image based on a particular map that you clicked on, and then you see the real-time image of the current storm situation at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So these are different types of maps. Once again, they're not containerized. You can have one that can be more than one. Now let's discuss some uses of web maps. Why are people using them? And when we think about users, we got to think about them in two different ways. Kind of the general public as users, but then also cartographers and geographers and people who want to access data and want to create maps, and then how they kind of use web maps. And so most people it's the top two. And so the average consumer of maps, the average user is of web maps is going to doing it for navigational purposes. They enter in a location. And so they meet a new friend invites them over and says, okay, here's my address. They're just going to punch it into the web map, typically Google or Apple Maps currently at the moment, and essentially it's going to tell them the best direction. It's going to tell them the most fuel efficient. It's going to tell them how long it's going to take them. It's going to tell them about traffic. It's going to provide a variety of information. But for the most part, the user, they can't really change the information. They maybe can click on and click off certain layers, but they can't change the underlying data. Similarly with searching, you might put in, okay, I want to know where all the furniture stores are within a 50-mile radius. So I'll just go to one of those favorite web map search engines and essentially put in furniture stores, and it'll tell me all the nearest ones. Even further, they'll give me other attribute information like the rate, the consumer rate that they're given. So maybe out of 5 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars. I can get different reviews and comments on the particular furniture store. Or I can maybe say, okay, I want to go to on my way home, I want to go to a grocery store to pick up bread. And so what's the nearest grocery store to IUPUI's campus? I just do a search. And oftentimes it does a search based on where you're located. But let's say I'm not located on campus. I can then move my location to Indianapolis, and I can essentially use that web map. I can interact with it, and I can essentially find and search for different things at different scales and different geographies. But once again, can't really change the underlying data too much. Next up is government or public data repository. And so this is where the government can use web maps to provide information. So you might see the Indiana Department of Transportation might be constantly creating a map that shows real-time traffic data. That's a government information being provided for the public. But also you can find web maps that are essentially places in which data is stored there. So you can see essentially data. And so there's the Indiana Spatial Data Portal, which is a public data site in which you can go access data for different locations, and you can then download that and put it in GIS, put it in wherever, then start creating maps. But also we think about the Census Bureau. They essentially have interactive maps in which it shows you demographic information. So you can go to the U.S. Census website, search for the different interactive web maps, and you can find demographic information. And so it's a place in which you can then search for, let's say I want demographic information for a particular county, and I can then look for, I want to know percent of the population that's let's say Asian, and I can then find that information. So essentially web maps provide information that provide, and they hold data, and sometimes that data they're just providing it, and they're not really, you go ahead and analyze it, teach us, help, to add to the greater body of knowledge. Further, other aspects of web maps is just creating and sharing data. And so this is kind of cool, in which, the whole open source idea, in which people are kind of constantly creating and sharing geographic data via web maps. And there's several examples of these, but OpenStreetMap and Open Topography. But OpenStreetMap OSM is one in which you haven't used already. I highly suggest going there and perusing. Of course, there is some problems with downloading data that other people have created, because you don't know how accurate it is, and so you got to kind of fine-tooth comb it, make sure it looks good and all of that. But it's web maps, the idea that we're collaborating with each other, and this is kind of goes way back. But there was the Haitian hurricane that came through there and wiped out everything. And so what people were doing, they were kind of creating maps, in real-time maps via the OpenStreetMap site. So they're essentially creating data and sharing it in real time, and it was doing a lot of good for the greater good. Next up, analysis. That's just simply where you just, using the web maps like we have in this class to just create and find new information. So you might want to do an analysis as far as, what happened in a recent election in a particular county. So you can look at it and look at different census tracts, and you can go deeper and maybe look at the block group level. So essentially what you can do is you can do analysis. And so this is stuff in which it's widely available. And beforehand, before the era of web maps, you couldn't do these kind of types of analyses where you have all this data available, and then you start investigating as far as why. Data wasn't available. You couldn't get to it. It was in paper form. You had to then transfer it to a computer. Oh, so much tedious work doing that. And finally, using web maps just to have fun. I mean, it's something we don't do enough in life. So, oftentimes I'll just, as I'm searching, look for places to visit. Look at the next vacation site we might go to. Or maybe an event might happen, an Olympic Games or a cool sporting event, and I'll search on it. Or maybe I'll find out someone's hometown. I'll meet him, and I'll go home and I'll search, and I'll just kind of zoom in and kind of look around their area, see how big their town is and what kind of grocery stores they have, and all that. Just kind of having fun, just this learning. And that's just the last thing I just like to say as far as purposes or uses of web maps.